You know, for centuries, the absolutely gruesome crimes of serial killers have sparked this really strange mix of pure terror and, well, a morbid curiosity. These are stories that repel us, but for some reason, we just can't seem to look away. So let's get right into it, because that is the big question, isn't it? What is it about these figures that just grabs our collective imagination? Well, some psychologists think it might be a way for us to safely confront our biggest fears. Or maybe, just maybe, trying to understand why they did what they did gives us a tiny sense of control in a world that can feel pretty chaotic.
And believe me, this fascination is not random at all. When you start looking at some of the most notorious killers in history, you can actually see them fall into these distinct archetypes. And these patterns, they don't just help us categorize them, they actually reflect the very fears and fascinations we all grapple with. So, let's start by going way back, to the figures from the distant past. I'm talking about the killers whose horrifying deeds have been told and retold so many times that they've become almost mythical. They really set the stage for our whole fascination with evil. Okay, this slide shows such a fascinating contrast in historical horror. On one side, you've got Elizabeth Bathory, the so-called Blood Countess, a powerful, wealthy noble whose evil was supposedly on a scale so massive it literally inspired vampire legends. And on the other side, Jack the Ripper, a total phantom. His terror came from his complete anonymity and the brutal, chilling mystery that to this day still surrounds him. 600. Just look at that number. This represents the truly staggering scale of Bathory's alleged crimes. I mean, the Guinness Book of World Records actually lists her as the most prolific female murderer ever. And even if historians debate the exact number, it's a figure that is almost impossible to wrap your head around.
Okay, so let's watch how this whole concept evolves. We're moving from those historical legends to a much more modern and, you could argue, a much more terrifying archetype. The killer who literally lives right next door, hiding their monstrous side behind a perfect mask of normalcy.
I mean, just think about John Wayne Gacy. If you lived in his community back in the 1970s, you'd think he was a model citizen. He was a local businessman, he was active in politics, and he was known as a guy who genuinely seemed to love making kids happy.
He even had a persona for it, Pogo the Clown. And it's that detail right there that makes what he did so deeply chilling. That happy, painted-on smile was the perfect facade for an absolutely unspeakable darkness. Because behind that clown makeup, the horrifying reality was that Gacy tortured and murdered at least 33 young men and teenage boys. He buried most of them right in the crawlspace under his own house. I mean, this was the nightmare next door in its most literal, terrifying form.
And then you have Dennis Rader, a church president, a Boy Scout leader. He didn't just hide in plain sight. He bragged about what he did. He created his own terrifying brand, the BTK Killer, and taunted the police for years. It's just more proof that pure evil can be thriving in the most mundane, everyday settings.
And all this talk of branding and personas brings us to our third archetype, the killers, who didn't just hide or haunt from the shadows. No, these are the ones who actively used modern media to become household names, feeding a public that was, let's be honest, both horrified and hungry for every last detail.
David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, is a perfect example. He didn't just commit crimes, he spun this bizarre media narrative around them. I mean, this quote about his neighbor's demon dog, it's completely outlandish, but it was absolute gold for newspaper headlines. It turned his crime spree into a citywide spectacle. But really, no one mastered the media quite like Ted Bundy. He was handsome, he was intelligent, he was charismatic. His murder trial was one of the very first to be televised nationally, and people were completely captivated. They saw this charming man on their screens, not the monster who had murdered dozens and dozens of women. He basically turned his own trial into a performance, and in doing so became a kind of dark celebrity. And then there were some, like Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, who just leaned into the infamy with pure, unadulterated defiance. This shocking quote, which he said right after being convicted, wasn't a confession, it wasn't a plea, it was one last chilling performance for the cameras, cementing his place in the history of evil.
So, all this media notoriety, it leads directly to the final phase of their infamy, which is how these killer stories get absorbed and retold. How they're transformed from grim, awful reality into entertainment for all of us to consume.
I mean, just look at this list.
From H.H. Holmes's infamous murder castle to Jeffrey Dahmer's gruesome crimes, their stories have become best-selling books, blockbuster movies, and huge streaming series. This constant retelling makes sure that they are never, ever forgotten, and it embeds them permanently into our cultural landscape.
Which brings us right back to where we started. But now, the question has a new, sharper focus. Our fascination is what drives the creation of all this content, for sure, but it also forces us to ask a really difficult question. In our quest to understand these monsters, at what point do we stop trying to explain and start glorifying? Where do we draw that line?